Good evening, everyone. We welcome you to the first edition of the Geographical Quartet in the Botanical Garden in the heart of Bonn. My name is Fatma Al-Harthy, a visiting student from Tanzania, part of the Erasmus program that is interested in the development challenges and human geography. Together with today's round of experts, we would like to discuss topics centering around development geography and global change. The climate crisis is a manifesting reality with a set of massive consequences only part to unfold now, with far-reaching implications for all possible futures. We take more from the earth than the ecological system can provide. Deserts are spreading, freshwater resources are dwindling, species being lost at unpredictable scale. We see development paradigms from the global north that hold the potential for detrimental effects on societies in the global south. The place that we find ourselves today, the Botanical Garden, carries so much history that is closely linked to colonialism. The theft of plants and genetical materials, the hibernization of some specimens, and the birth of cash crops. A display of exotism that we still marvel at today. More of this later when we all reflect more deeply on the entangled history of the discipline of geography with the colonial project from the 19th to the 20th century. And I would like to extend my warm welcome to our distinguished guests in today's quartet, of whom we all know that they are experts of today's topic. I will start with Professor Lisa Schipper. She is a professor of development geography at the University of Bonn and conducts groundbreaking research on vulnerability and climate change. Before coming to the University of Bonn, she was an environmental social science research fellow of the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. She is also a coordinating lead author of the 6th IPCC assessment report. And I would also want to welcome Professor Detlef Müller-Mahn. He is a senior professor of development geography at the University of Bonn and initiator of collaborative research center Future Rural Africa, author of a multitude of influential books and papers about risk research and social cultural geography, with a genuine focus on the African subcontinent. His most renowned book is called The Spatial Dimension of Risk: How Geography Shapes of Emergence of Riskscapes. And last but not least, I would also like to welcome Professor Dorothea Kleine. She is a professor of human geography in Sheffield and the director of the Institute for Global Sustainable Development. Professor Kleine's groundbreaking research focuses on sustainable human development, global justice, and the role of digital technologies in achieving these utmost crucial goals. She is the author of Technologies of Choice, ICTs, Development, and the Capabilities Approach. Our today's discussion is divided into 4 sessions, starting with the discussion on the discipline of geography development, before moving on to the global challenges, particularly the climate crisis, and closing with reflection on participation, technology, and future making. Thank you and welcome to the discussion. So we'll start with Professor Detlef Müller-Mahn, and he will introduce us and talk more about what development geography is and what you can get from it, and he will continue from there. Welcome.
What development geography is, how many minutes do I have? So first of all, a warm welcome also to the audience. I'm glad that so many of you are here in such a wonderful weather. And also, thank you very much for organizing this event. I think it's really a good idea, and this is an experimental thing we are doing right here. So we don't know where we will be in an hour from now in this discussion. The way I understood the topic is that we are coming from different perspectives within development geography, and I see my job now in the coming, how many minutes you said, 3-4 minutes, to position myself within development geography, because none of us is covering everything, and we all have a critical position towards what development may be, and I think that's something very important. What you mentioned, Fatma, is that as scientists, we are part of a changing world, and that means that we are also responsible to what is happening and what we do and what we not do, because we can't cover everything. We do have an experience and specializations in parts of what our discipline, human geography, covers, and we're trying to do the best with this experience. So what I would like to talk about, and we were invited to use books and refer to books in order to introduce the topic, is a little bit my positioning within the history of development geography, because I've worked as a development geographer for several decades, going back at first to 5 years of working as a development officer in development. So I was responsible at that time for a project of GTZ, and I'm very glad I left that field. So I do no longer want to be involved in actually taking responsibility for development projects, but rather try to take a critical position towards what is happening there. And to introduce, I brought a couple of books, can keep it shorter. To introduce this, if you like, my personal development as a development geographer, the first book that's important for me is a book typically in German by Fred Scholz, Geographische Entwicklungsforschung. So this is somehow, it's an overview of how Fred Scholz at that time, book was published in 2003, saw the importance, the relevance of development geography, and the point he made, and that's something also important for me, is that he understood development geography very much under the impression of the Latin American dependencia discussion. So development for him and for the theoreticians of development theory and the dependencia theory, development means liberation, freedom. Amartya Sen and other authors play an important role. So this is the point I want to make here, a highly political understanding of what development is all about. Then this understanding of development came under critique, and quite typically that's more in English books, and I just brought one by Rob Potter and a number of other authors on development geography in English, key concepts in development geography. And the point these authors make is that development is not simply a program, but it links up to the colonial legacies, and we need to come to an understanding what we do about that. So development means getting involved, but the big question is on which grounds, with which normative background, and for which purposes. Quite typically, and that's the difference between these two books, Fred Scholz and the Dependencia series, these are grand models of global development. What we experienced over the past 20 years was more like a fascination for micro-geographies of development. So vulnerability, poverty, agency, and other concepts played an important role. So it was more like the small is beautiful kind of things. But the problem I see with these approaches of the past 20 to 30 years is that these medium-range concepts actually forget about the grand framework and context of development. And what I find important now, and that's so important for my current activities, is to understand development from the perspective of our partners in the Global South. And development, they wouldn't talk about development, but what they would talk about, and what we are doing in a large-scale research project at the moment, is we are trying to understand development as a form of future making. And I brought just one book, Felwine Sarr, a Senegalese economist who wrote about something that he calls Afrotopia. So there's an idea of an ideal future which builds upon African values. I find this concept very fascinating, and at the same time when you read the book, you realize there's a lot of nice fantasy in it, but this won't work. This is just fantasy. It's what he is describing here is a world that builds upon solidarity, family ties, somehow the whole world like a village. And this is something where I would say it's a very nice idea, it's very sympathetic, but we can't turn the wheel backwards. We can't turn the time backwards. But we need to understand futures and future making in this direction of Afrotopia. I'm very sympathetic with that, but in a way that it takes into account the growing challenges the world is facing. Climate change is one of them, but there are many other challenges that the world is dealing with. And this is what we are currently doing in a large interdisciplinary research center here in Bonn and Cologne under the topic Future Rural Africa. We are trying to understand how African societies, intellectuals, communities envision their own futures and what they're doing in order to make these ideas of their futures real. So this is where we are right now. So far, the Collaborative Research Center has worked for 6 years already. I hope there will be another 6 years, and I do also hope that at least part of that time I will be part of it. I think that's all from my side. That was 3.5 minutes, right?
Okay, I have 2 questions to ask in the short discussion that you made. The first is, in your experience, what led to the difference of development geography between the global south and global north?
The immediate experience and the confrontation with the reality people are living in. So especially in Latin America in the 1970s, development theory was confronted with the day-to-day experience of injustice and the lack of freedom. And that was the reason why in the 1970s it was especially people working under the Catholic Church who engaged in new ideas of conceptualizing development. This is something here in the global north, we are in a very comfortable situation. So we may do research wherever that may be in the world, but if it becomes too dangerous or uncomfortable, we just run away. I think this is something we really have to respect, that the people working in the south are there and they do not run away, but they are the ones who are really confronting these difficult situations. That explains, I think that's the most important explanation to come to grips with the difference of theory in the south and the north.
Yes, and what do you think are the challenges that hinder development geography globally? You explained this point in the first.
Well, that's a very personal statement, I would hear. So the term development has come under pressure in a way that many people don't like to use it any longer. I think that's fine, but I think it's the wrong conclusion from this, that quite often these very intricate problems and the causes of dependencies and underdevelopment are no longer studied. And people are shying away from the key problems of development and underdevelopment by focusing on other topics that look more technical, more environmental, more easily handleable in a way. And I think that's the wrong conclusion. We should insist on facing the problems people are living with in the global south. Poverty is a reality. Right now, 6 million people in East Africa are immediately threatened by famine. These are realities we have to face, and it's not enough only to talk about fashionable topics that fit well into theoretical debates, but do not solve the problems of these 6 million people faced by famine.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Müller-Mahn. So, because time is already on our side, we're going to move on to the global challenges and climatic crisis that is going to be explained by Professor Lisa Schipper. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting. So, how to think about, and why do we use development geography as a lens for thinking about the climate crisis? I think that's what I want to talk a little bit about. I think that development geography, and I should say development studies more broadly, is the most important way that we can look at this issue, because actually we tend to think that climate change is a very technical problem, right? That it has something that's resulting from all these things that we're doing, and that our solution is to have somehow better cars that are electric, or refrigerators that don't use as much power, or some kind of alternative fuels and things like that. But actually the problem isn't really technical. The problem is very much about human behavior, about human development, and therefore if we don't look at those issues, the poverty issues that were just raised, the famine issues, then we're not actually going to be able to find a solution either. So I have brought today this book, which is Amitav Ghosh's The Nutmeg's Curse. And The Nutmeg's Curse is actually, Amitav Ghosh writes novels, but he also writes books that address climate crisis. And in particular, this book was trying to, and I think successfully does, tell the story of how colonialism is at the root cause of climate change. And here it is actually, funnily enough, we're sitting in this botanical garden, and this begins with the story of the nutmeg, and tracing sort of how the nutmeg became such an important commodity that it eventually led to the destruction of the people who were living on the islands where it was actually growing. And this was initially by the Dutch, who came and they wanted to have the nutmeg, and they decided that the only way to get it was to kill all the people in the island where it was growing. And we see the similar kinds of resource extraction more broadly all over the planet. And what this demonstrates is this power imbalance between the countries that actually have all the resources that we want and that we need to live, and the countries that have the money and the power and the weapons and so on to get those things that we want. And that continues to be the story of climate change, and it continues to be the challenge that we're facing, looking at how to even resolve this problem. Right now, we're here, and there's a climate change conference going on just a few kilometers away. One of the sticking points that has been there forever is about funding, because climate change is caused by the global north living the life, having all of these advantages, these privileges, but doing so because the countries in the global south have suffered. So it is always been very, very unbalanced. And now the global south is asking, give us please some support so that we can overcome these problems. Please stop with your greenhouse gas emissions also, by the way, but also make sure that there is some funding so that we can actually somehow manage, it's not just to address the impacts of climate change, but actually also to address the fact that we've lost all these development opportunities as a result of climate change. So this book tells that story very nicely, which is also why I assigned it to my students, but I think that it does also raises issues around whose kind of knowledge we're drawing on to make decisions about how to address climate change. So one of the other topics that I look at is precisely what is this climate change knowledge that all the decision makers are making, and how, again, taking development geography lens, where does that knowledge come from? Whose knowledge is it? So we see that there's already a hierarchy, a disciplinary hierarchy, where the natural sciences, again, because we think that climate change is this technical physics problem that we need to address with that kind of knowledge, physical scientists tend to get more kind of attention in terms of what they say about climate change. As a consequence, social scientists, including many human geographers, don't get to contribute as much. And so all of that dimension about the inequalities, the power dynamics, and those things get left out. And consequently, I argue, we have not solved the problem, partly because we're not drawing on the correct kind of knowledge. But also, I think what's important to keep in mind is that we've got, when I come and present an issue around adaptation to climate change, for example, say, look, here we can see that there's problems. These adaptation projects are not effective. They're not working. They're actually making people worse off because most of the decisions are taken in countries far away where the money is sitting about they're designing these projects. So we call that maladaptation, when adaptation makes people worse off. But the concept of maladaptation can also be weaponized and used to say, as a result of adaptation projects failing so badly, without really saying that it's because they're badly planned and they're badly executed, maybe we shouldn't do any more adaptation. And maybe we shouldn't do any more development cooperation on adaptation. So I think, we need to, looking at the climate crisis, we need to be cautious also as scientists, knowledge producers, that we recognize that even within these problems or solutions that we identify, or the problems that we identify, there can be different perspectives that we need to be aware of before we go around saying, hey, by the way, think about maladaptation. Your projects are going to fail. You're not including the local communities in planning your projects, for example. But that could be the reason to say, well, let's not talk about maladaptation anymore, even though it's happening so much and lots of money is getting lost as a result, and people are worse off as a result, because we don't want the aid for adaptation to stop. So let's pretend that maladaptation doesn't happen. So I'm trying to illustrate that these different forms of knowledge, these different approaches, they are rooted very much in a hierarchy that isn't just disciplinary, but is also coming from, where does that knowledge come from? Most of the climate knowledge comes from the global north. And very, very little of it comes from the global south. But also I think that is one fact that has to do with very sort of systemic barriers that are in place, but that also is rooted in, exactly like colonialism, deeply in racism and these kinds of biases that are creating attitudes about what kind of knowledge matters the most. So it travels all the way back up. So what Amitav Ghosh talks about many, many hundred years ago are kind of this beginning of these searching for these commodities, still playing out in these conference rooms at the climate change conference very much. I think that's what I would contribute.
Thank you so much, Professor Lisa. I have a few questions for you. You said you participated the UNFCCC climate negotiation in Bonn. Mm-hmm. And can you give us a first-hand account from the work of the UNFCCC and where you see it heading at the moment?
Okay, to try to remain potentially a little bit optimistic at least. It's been going on for many years. The UN Framework Convention was entered into force in 1994. So it's sort of next year is going to be 30 years of these negotiations. And like I was alluding to, they're really not, the model is the same. The funding is still the pivot point. The funding, who is going to fund, are we going to fund? And that's why they sit there for so long. They decide what language will allow us to have funding from the global south and the global north. What language will allow us so that we don't have to provide so much funding? So there's always that tension on every single topic. It doesn't matter what the topic is. It's always going to be that way. But then you also have, of course, these very certain countries who would rather not have any fossil fuel use reduced at all because that's what they live on. And so there are also these very strong countries. And the problem is that they belong also to the global south countries. And so when they work together in blocks, they can sometimes dominate. And so, for example, the small islands are supposed to have one position also with the OPEC countries, the oil producing countries. But of course, the small islands are the ones who are going to be suffering the most. So they would actually really do want the greenhouse gas emissions to come down. So these tensions are continuously there. And I think if you walked in just off the street, you would be really shocked at the slow pace and how they discussed today. I sat and they were discussing whether they should have a link to a website in a footnote or not for about an hour. So that's kind of what the negotiations are like many, many times. But they're talking about really important global issues as well. It's just that if you get down to looking at the paragraphs, you don't notice that because you think, oh, this footnote, the website, which website, what, I mean, who cares? But of course, it will matter somehow. It's just really hard to understand how.
Okay. And you also said little knowledge about climate change is coming from the global south, which means most of the knowledge is coming from the global north. So in that case, what needs to change so that we can get that knowledge from global south and not be too dependent from the global north?
Yeah, I mean, one interesting example is that I think, and I'm probably going to get the statistic wrong because I can't remember exactly, but it's something like 6 or 3% of all funding for research in Africa goes to African institutions. And all the rest of the funding on climate change, presumably, is going to European, American, Australian institutions outside of Africa. So actually, the ownership of these projects is minimal, the African ownership. And so, I mean, this is one thing to start with, is how to actually ensure that there's actually really funding going, but also strengthening a lot of the institutions so that they can actually have researchers who can work with the money. But I think that's not enough. I mean, it is partly also this attitude, which again I would argue is rooted in racism around sort of, whose knowledge is actually valid. A lot of the climate models and so on are not sitting, they're sitting in the wealthy countries because the machines that we need to run them are very expensive and so on, really not a lot of power and so on. So it's partly kind of where's the money, where are the researchers, where's the capacity, but then also can we change this attitude around, it's, because it's not coming from a global north institution, it's not as valid or it's not as valuable. So there are multiple different things that we have to work on at the same time.
Okay. So this is the last one to drain you. As we all know, we said climate change is such a crucial matter, and to identify the most effective adaptation for it is a problem. You even said one does not work sometimes, but we're still doing it anyway. So in that case, what should change? Which adaptations should we use that you think are right in climate change?
Right, so here, I mean, I think one of the first things you have to do is identify who all the actors are who actually influence this process, right? So I would usually put most of the blame for the mistakes on the development funders, who very often do the designing of the projects, and then maybe they put take the project in one continent and just put it in another continent and say, oh, that's going to work. It worked here, let's see if it works there, and yeah. But also because they tend to collaborate with the powerful actors in country as well, because those are the actors that get there first, and then they end up being the ones who also dominate and take up the funding and control the funding for the projects. So it is important to understand the local context. It's important to go out of the way to actually make sure that you co-design the projects with wherever you are going to be working. And there is a model that we talk about now a lot, which is called locally led adaptation. And that kind of adaptation, it hands over not just the design, it hands also over the management, the implementation, and the money directly to the local level. I think it still could have some problems, but the point is that it has only 1% of funding for adaptation has been going all the way down to the local level at this point. So it could make a huge difference to see adaptation strategies that are rooted in local context, that are looking at kind of the future, the kinds of aspirations that people have on a local level, and not aspirations from those people sitting somewhere else to say, oh, we need to achieve resilience. But we all have different kinds of resilience in mind.
Thank you so much, Prof Lisa Schipper. So we'll move to the next discussion, which is about technology and future making, which will be introduced by Professor Dorothea Kleine. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, so for my part, I'm supposed to be talking about technology, but actually I would like to take us back to the lives that people imagine themselves leading. So fundamentally, my take on this is that we need to move away from a single narrative of development to one that actually takes into account the lives that people themselves have reason to value. So this is, speaks very much in the language of Amartya Sen that also Detlef has already introduced, and the influential book there for me would have been his book in 1999 about development as freedom. Some of us have taken those impulses from an Indian economist and philosopher to think about what that means for technology. And for starters, it means that we actually start with having conversations with people, potentially with participatory methods, about the things that they themselves have reason to value, the lives that they themselves value. And that means we account for cultural diversity, and we respect that, multiple knowledges, but it also means interpersonal choices that people have. So I think that's a really important angle for me. And then based on that, we can talk about what kind of technical innovations might actually come into play. We know that, for instance, mobile phones have been a game changer for a lot of people, whether it's in the global north or the global south. But what kind of functionalities people are using on that phone actually differs from person to person. And we need to also respect people's choices in terms of their what we call digital sovereignty, actually withdrawing from particular forms of technology use, because, for example, for privacy reasons, they don't want to give their data, or that they choose, given the wider context of large technology actors actually dominating those kinds of functionalities and actually also the revenue models, that they may not want to be part of that. So, you know, classic example would be who of your friends is on WhatsApp, who's on Signal, who's on Telegram, and who doesn't want to do anything of those. And we're seeing some of these discussions also happening in a lot of our kind of partner countries. At the same time, I think when we talk about the lives that people themselves have reason to value, that already gives us an out away from thinking about development in the sort of dominant paradigm, which is that, you know, the dominant paradigm over decades has been development equals economic growth. And we are in a time where, frankly, we can't afford to think in that way anymore. The ecological limits are very obvious. And the question is now, can we create the sort of the cultural innovation and the imaginative innovation to think about lifestyles that are pro-well-being, pro-flourishing, but not necessarily pro-ever more material wealth. And this is a challenge for the global north because so far we collectively haven't shown a lot of creativity in that space. We are in the global north, we are over-consuming, and we are probably world leading in creating narratives of consumption and overconsumption. So we need to think about that and in many ways learn about different narratives there. But also in the global south, we need to have conversations about within ecological limits, how can we grow non-material resources as well? So in a lot of the participatory projects that we do, we talk about what people themselves value. And for example, social resources and social links are really important to people. And that isn't a global north or a global south thing. So these are questions about how we also invest in social ties. Then there's questions about psychological resources. We know that through participatory practice, we can celebrate people's psychological resources. Often people are also under stress, and we can at least find ways through collective solidarity where people might be supporting each other. You know, resilience is an overused term, but fundamentally, how can we be supportive of each other? Maybe also use techniques of collective solidarity to become collectively more resilient at a time when there's a lot of bad news out there, but we still have to retain the power to be imaginative and creative. So psychological resources are, for me, really important. But Detlef also mentioned the challenge of not losing sight of some of the structural conditions. So this isn't some romantic, let's just sit by the fire, think about, alternative narratives. It's also an acknowledgement about, what are the big structural pressures. And there I wanted to kind of talk about intersectionality as a kind of important concept. I could have chosen different people, but I've chosen Patricia Hill Collins' book on intersectionality as critical social theory, because to me it's a book that doesn't just talk about intersecting injustices that structure our society from just an activist point of view, but it's also a book that asks tough questions about social movements insufficiently engaging with theory. And that's a space where, as a social scientist, I feel more at home, because I want to be thinking in an activist mindset, but with theory. I want that combination, and I want us to challenge each other so that we don't all just happily agree with each other, but continuously also challenge our analytical thinking. And I think my final book that I wanted to introduce is Walter Mignolo's Politics of Decolonial Investigation, because quite frankly, when we think about how we might innovate, how we think about our lives in different ways, we have to learn from each other. And that means being really open to different kinds of knowledge, as Lisa was kind of alluding to. Also different kinds of how knowledge is packaged. And what Mignolo in the book is also talking about is that we have relied very heavily on a Western canon, and a Western canon also not just of knowledge, but of what is legitimate knowing and what are legitimate ways of living. We now have a lot of more discussion in our field about epistemic diversity, including alternative sort of epistemologies like Buen Vivir, Eco-Swaraj, about also Ubuntu. And we shouldn't take these as like new canonized sort of big building blocks. We should just use them as examples of being open for alternative ways of seeing and actually listening to voices from other parts of the world. So that we can have real dialogue, but always with the analytical fierceness to basically engage also in quite robust discussions with whatever models were being offered. But maybe also with a generosity of spirit in that we believe that we can all learn from each other, cross-culturally and across disciplines. So that's kind of where I'd position us today in complex times, multi-crisis, but still a little bit of hope that if we have a good dialogue culture, we might still be able to imagine positive futures.
Thank you so much. And I have a couple of questions. The first, you talked about the signifiers of the life we value, yes, and about the technical revolution and evolution of the book that you said. And do you think that can technology bring gender equality, gender values, and participatory process and fair trade? And if it does, what works and what does not?
So you've given me a wonderful formulation there, in that you asked, can technology bring, and then fill in the blank. And I can immediately say, don't think so. Because technology, as it says, should never be reified away from humans. So it is humans who create technologies and socio-technical innovation, and therefore, whatever technology there is, we have to engage with the creators, the human creators that produce technological artifacts, systems, and the political economy around that technology. So we must never forget that there are people behind those technologies. And that gives us also, in reverse, a chance to shape the world, including our future technical worlds. From another perspective, you brought in sort of gender equality. One of the challenges that we have is that a lot of the technological futures that are currently being shaped are being shaped by, frequently based in the global north, youngish, middle-aged men, frequently a middle class, frequently white, and with a vision of the future or the lives that they value, which is very, very far removed from the majority world and the interests of many people, for instance, in rural Eastern Africa. And also when we kind of think about different people's lives, far away from care responsibilities, and care responsibilities are still gendered, we frequently also don't see women's interests represented in the technological innovation that is kind of happening. And so we've got a project called Geographisches, which is about gender justice in women in STEM, but it's fundamentally also about bringing women as co-designers into digital innovation spaces. We're interested in how to make those innovation spaces more gender just for women and other gender minorities. So I think it's really important that we widen the space in terms of who takes part in design processes of technology, because I think then technology will serve more purposes, including for people who are less privileged.
Thank you so much. Professor Schipper once said the use of technology, such as the use of cars and all that, they're not the major source of climate crisis, but they are technology. How do you link technology with sustainable development or development geography?
Yeah. So I think a few things there. So for starters, I work a lot with engineers, I work a lot with computer scientists and so forth, and I think we need to have an honest conversation with them to what degree ecological limits must be seen as part of the design specifications. So they're used to designing with all kinds of complicated design specifications. Well, one of them is resource use. So we need to be a lot clearer about integrating that. And not all of the artifacts that are currently being produced, technical artifacts, actually recognize, things like e-waste, energy consumption, or other ecological footprints of those technologies. I think on the plus side, there are some opportunities for all kinds of technical innovations to potentially contribute to sustainable development. I mean, there's a lot of, if you want, frugal innovation, more grassroots innovation, which does help when it comes to, for example, energy provision. But I think what is less talked about, especially in the area of digital technologies, is also the sustainability cost of producing those technologies. And I've already mentioned energy. We also haven't solved the difficulty of conflict minerals, for instance, in different kinds of technical devices. We talk a lot about the circular economy, but if you think of where a lot of our laptops and our phones end up, that is not a circular economy. There's minimal reuse of what actually goes in terms of components. So I'm seriously concerned about us not treating the sustainability costs of the technology that we use seriously, that is sort of an afterthought. I think it needs to be central to our discussion, whether or not it's worth bringing in technology in a particular, for example, a particular project at a local level.
Thank you. If you compare technology and gender equality and social injustice, if you compare Global South and Global North, you will find that in Global South, there is, like, gender inequality is at its worst compared to the global north? And if that is so, what should be done to solve that issue?
I think I really appreciate sort of the direction of your question, but I think we probably need to move away from the binaries of kind of talking about global north and global south there. So I do, for example, some work with colleagues in South Africa and with some colleagues in Uganda, and the way that gender justice is framed in those two countries is very, very different, including what constitutional rights are there for women in the two countries. But if I were to go back to Patricia Hill-Collins, she would also point out that, you know, if you want the possibilities and the choices that an educated, urban, middle-class woman in Nairobi has compared to a rural woman in Western Pukot, for example, that those life realities are dramatically different. So as geographers, I think we need to unpack the sort of the big binary, and then we need to further unpack sort of the supposed container of the country and go ever further down. I think this is where intersectional thinking can help us. And then I think we need to also ask ourselves whether there are countries with perfect gender equality achieved. And I think if we look, for example, at unpaid care, I haven't yet discovered those countries that have completed the kind of gender equality question when it comes to unpaid care. So I also think that humility is needed by whichever countries in the global north that are pontificating about global gender equality and so forth.
Okay, so when you think about a future worth living in, what impulses come to mind and what kind of freedom do you see developing?
Well, I think this brings me back to also having these really interesting conversations with people individually, because I would like to move away from, as it were, single narratives. So it is more about sort of interpersonal narratives, interpersonal differences in those narratives. And I think it's a listening culture also between cultures and between people. Personally, I think in my life, I'd like to think more about time and being rich in time and in deep time and in moments of sort of deeper engagement with the people I care about, but also interesting strangers, as it were. And thinking about time richness, I think is something that is, for me, is at least something that is, you know, in coming from quite a privileged position, obviously, is something that resonates almost as much as, or actually as much as material resources.
Thank you so much for this intellectual discussion, the journey through the development paradigm, and then we talked about the climate crisis and entangled history, political change, the technology, the recommendation of the books.
I mean, this was really very interesting, and what we've seen is lots of facets of very relevant, timely topics. And the question I would have, I don't have a conclusion, but rather the question is, what does all this have to do with geography and development geography? And more specifically, what is the strength of geography to study all these different topics? What brings all this together? And what is, if you like, the relative advantage of our discipline, geography, as compared to all these other disciplines that are also studying these issues? And if I may begin with an attempt of an answer, I see the strength of geography because all this is deeply related to geography. I see the strength of geography exactly in bringing all these different topics together. In, on the one hand, having a look and an understanding of the structural conditions of an unfair world that is running into an apocalypse, if you like. And then on the other hand, methods that we have to look at what is going on at the micro level and to understand that, for example, what Lisa Schipper is studying, adaptation is quite often not adaptation to climate change, although it looks like something like that, but it is adaptation to incentives that have something to do with funding, with development agencies, with whatever, but it's not adaptation to climate change. And if you are in this one discipline of geography able to, on the one hand, look at the world at large and the structural conditions that somehow make the world turn around, and then on the other hand, see how maladaptation is actually brought about through this structural system, that may actually be more than just looking at either side separately. And that's where I see the unique strength of geography in studying these global issues.
Thank you so much. If I was to add, I will talk about my experience in my country, Tanzania, because as part of Africa, Tanzania is a part of the global south, and we face different challenges, different development geographical challenges in my country. And as a country, we have rich natural resources from species available, biodiversity, plenty of national parks and the forest around, which is incredible. But we are facing environmental unsustainability, like methods of sustaining the products that we have, the resources that we have, and this is due to shortage of awareness. We do have institutions that teach these kind of things, but most people, if you go back to what Professor Müller-Mahn said earlier, poverty is the issue. So most people in the rural cannot afford to go to school due to infrastructure being poor. So from the start, we cannot solve this issue of unsustainability because of lack of awareness. Because from the start, the children in the rural community, they cannot go to school due to poor infrastructure, or the energy resources available are very expensive. Not everyone can afford to buy gas. So what will they do? Deforestation come in. That's when they'll go to the forest and cut down trees, and 90% of Tanzanians use charcoal instead of gas or stoves. And this is not because they do not want to protect their environment. They do, but that's the only option they have, or else they won't be able to feed their children. So these are the things that us as a country or as youth would want to change in the future, because we do have so many resources compared to various other countries, but we do not have the technology or the means to improve them. And another thing are fundings. We are among the developing countries, so most of the fundings are not going to the locals. So it has to start to the locals first, because they are the ones that are closer to the resources. And awareness should be given to these people, because if you want to protect the forest, they should know. I'm doing my research. My master's thesis is about non-timber forest products, and it's about creating awareness on how to improve these non-timber forest products. You do not have to depend on wood products such as timber, because you will not sustain or conserve the forest for the future of other generation. So what you should do, you should use these fruits, spices, and nuts growing in the forest so that you can get income, probably by using the fruits that are found in the forest. You can make juice out of it and sell in the streets and probably get something out of it. Or you can transport these fruits and these medicines or spices found in the forest and sell them as medicines to other countries or nearby countries. That's how you can grow our economy. But the problem comes in funding. They can do that, the locals can do it, they are ready to do it, but they do not have the support to do it. So at the end of the day, they'll just go back to cutting down trees because it's the easiest way. And probably it's not allowed, but they'll still do it in an illegal way just for them to survive. So if we create more awareness and if we bring more technology to the locals, then we can develop most countries in Africa.
Hopefully.
Yes, hopefully.
I guess just to going off of what you've just said, and maybe this notion of plural narratives and multiple narratives, and I think I would probably talk about climate justice, which has emerged as such an important kind of rallying notion for, we have to think about who is being affected by climate change, and the poorest, the ones who have the least resources, are the ones who are the least able to actually deal with the problems and change things. But I think it's important to keep in mind that what we understand as climate justice is very different in different places, and so it is definitely therefore important to look at it through development geography. It's not just a political concept that political scientists might look at, or something that has to do maybe just from a sociologist's perspective, like how are people getting activated, how are they protesting, and so on. But certainly we need to understand it from a development geography perspective to say that what's climate justice for me might not be the same thing for you, right? And how do we accommodate that, and how do we create these multiple different kinds of narratives around it to make sure that there isn't anybody that is suffering because my climate justice narrative is getting, I'm pushing something that could then end up making somebody else worse off.
Thank you so much.
Detlef mentioned, why geography and what's the contribution, and I do think geography can be also seen as a fulcrum for a lot of these discussions. So for starters, the history of geography is deeply bound up in the history also of the sort of colonial exploration, and therefore also of kind of earlier, very unequal cultural exchanges. And so it's almost in the nature of the subject that it's also our job. We carry responsibility for some of these earlier, as it were, messed up encounters that were deeply infused by racism and patriarchy. And it's to some degree also our responsibility and our job to now be very proactive in trying to find out how we can have more positive encounters, more equitable partnerships. And so let's turn that responsibility and also the very important historical honesty about our subject into something positive and think about, right, how would we do this right now, right here? And how can we be one of the disciplines that lead on this thought, who want to kind of push on this thought? I think if we wanted to be hopeful about geography, I think there are particular strands of diversity that are already written into geographical ways of working. So our students and our staff members, by the very fact that they come into contact with physical sciences and social sciences and humanities all in the same department, I think we have a tradition in the subject of people actually listening to different forms of knowledge in the sense of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, sometimes transdisciplinary exchanges. So I think we're very well placed for that. In, I think, many geography departments, we practice engagement with stakeholders beyond the academy, which is also not the case in all disciplines. And again, that is a chance for us to also think about how we can have an impact in the world beyond writing books. I love books, but beyond writing books, how do we do that? And maybe also thinking about knowledge production kind of beyond the academic formats as well to reach a broader audience. So I think there are possibilities for diversity there. At the same time, our subject is still insufficiently diverse. We still have much more better resourced departments in the global north and in particular countries. So we need to think about how we balance that out. And there are many other kind of aspects, including the diversity of our staff members in class, race, gender, and other aspects where we can do more. But again, I would take that as a positive challenge and basically saying we've got some aspects of diversity where we are actually sort of, as it were, stronger or have advanced a bit more than other disciplines, but we have a long way to go. But I think we can take that as a positive challenge, as something that we do as a learning community together, including in intercultural exchange and learning from scholars across the globe.
Thank you so much for the discussion. I would now like to welcome the floor, the audience, to ask any questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about one point that Professor Kleine talked about, which I find quite interesting. As you are aware, in the 60s, 70s, a wave in post-colonial studies was initiated that also led to the post-development debate in development geography, which urged development geographers to scrutinize their positionality and their research. And what we are experiencing now is a new wave of decolonization. And I liked that you said this is a positive challenge that we are dealing with here. And the new wave of decolonization is not only urging us to be critical of ourselves, but it demands to decolonize our concepts, our research practices, and the whole discipline as such. And I would be interested in, my question is to all of you, what do you think is decolonization? What does it mean to you? And how you are dealing with that issue regarding your work?
I think one important point is that the decoloniality, post-coloniality debates in the 1960s, 70s were very different from today. The difference then was even in the 1950s. The difference then was that there was an urge to actively get involved. That was the time when the War of Liberation in Algeria was still going on. And leftist movements in the global north were actually supporting the FLN guerrillas in North Africa against the French army. Today, the tendency is exactly the opposite. It is something in the way of keeping out of these interferences, so leaving the global south outside of our debates. And personally, I think we can't run away from our responsibility. We are part of these relations, and for that reason I have a lot of sympathy of what people did in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when there was more decidedness and a position, an active position on the side of people who were fighting for civil rights and democracy and poverty alleviation, etc., in the global south, instead of just keeping outside and leaving things as they are.
I mean, I think actually in your question you actually addressed a lot of these things. What is it? What is decoloniality? Decolonizing academia, decolonizing research, decolonizing global politics. I think exactly these concepts, recognizing that you know, where are these concepts coming from, as I was talking about this, whose knowledge is dominating the agenda, the practices, as you said, how do we do this research? I think it's interesting to see how many students are actually now questioning whether it's actually coming from Europe. Is it really necessary to go to the field? Is that the best way for my short period of dissertation, that I could actually, you know, I don't really know the context. Do I really belong there? Should I do something different for my dissertation? Of course, the knowledge sources. I mean, this is something that we can do very easily, is decolonizing the reading list, decolonizing, you know, what would we talk about, you know, who are we inviting as guest lecturers and so on. But I also think, maybe I'm contradicting now, sort of. I mean, I do think actually that there are some topics, I mean, part of decoloniality is also recognizing that there are maybe some topics that really should be dealt with by global South scholars, and that actually we don't belong as global North scholars talking about those things. I I think that, you know, there are topics and perspectives, and I have to be honest, sometimes I feel like, wow, I really missed, you know, I missed completely what was going on. And I said something that was extremely kind of global north and privileged, and I didn't realize it, and I tried to make an effort, but there are things that are simply, without the lived experience, it's really, really difficult to recognize. And so I do think that there are certain topics, especially around identity and around kind of history and maybe relationship to land in particular, if you think about a lot of indigenous people, that if you haven't experienced those things, maybe you know, should give space to some other scholars who actually do have that experience to talk about those things.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. You brought up some kind of quite fundamental, a really fundamental question. I think that allows us to have just a quick strategic look around, and basically collaboration on, you know, global sustainable development, call it maybe also international solidarity, is under pressure from two sides. So on the one hand, you have, as it were, a sort of a critique position, often more from the left, kind of thinking about, you know, are we in a position where we should aim for any form of intervention? Should we just stay away from that? Whether that is sort of global north scholars, but also, as it were, urban elites kind of engaging in sort of rural or more disadvantaged kind of spaces. That's one piece of the critique. We're also seeing a lot of a rise of nationalist discourses that are basically saying, why should we care about anyone other outside of our countries? What's all of this international, global stuff? Let's, you know, we're living in a cost of living crisis. There's 101 things that we have to look out for in our cities, in our countries. And we're seeing a rise of, as it were, a sort of a nationalism and a sort of collective egocentricity. And I think, I personally think that this is not the time when we're facing an awful lot of challenges that are global in nature to go back to sort of an inward-looking nationalism. And so I have a lot of sympathy for the kind of critique position as well about maybe we shouldn't interfere and so forth, but I worry about the paralysis that comes from that. That basically puts us into oh, I can't talk about that because I'm not fully in this person's shoes, and I can't do anything because I'm insufficiently disadvantaged. Well, maybe it's time to engage with people in participatory ways, recognizing our own epistemic sort of traditions and our own limitations, but fundamentally building these dialogue situations in which we still dare to tackle the big challenges of our time with multiple voices, multiple stakeholders, but not shy away from them, and certainly not write another book on decoloniality. Well, frankly, there's an awful lot of stuff to kind of engage with in the world.
Thank you so much. So, any questions?
I have a very quick question building on what Detlef Müller-Mahn said. The term development is very contested and people shy away from it. And maybe to you, Professor Kleine, and to Professor Schipper, going forward from here in the next 10 to 20 years, will you defend the term development geography, or should we move away from it?
Well, I mean, I have to say that I do think that, you know, so my background is actually development studies, so it's really, it's even worse, I think, because it's not even including geography, which I think has its own kind of own space and own value beyond development. So this is really purely looking at development studies and based in the UK. So I think there, again, we're really talking about colonialist, you know, colonial history, and there isn't really any difference between, you know, it is the continuation of the colonial project in many ways. So I do think that I have had concerns about exactly how to represent myself, and perhaps I now have the chance to escape slightly from this by being now in a geography department and saying that I'm a development geographer, so that I don't have to only rely on that development dimension. But I certainly think that it is, I absolutely agree, it is contested, and it is difficult because inherently the question is, as Dorothea was saying, is it about economic development? And even when you talk about it as progress, there's still a certain element of, what progress toward what? Is it progress towards the things that, the global north has, and in that process destroying everybody as we go? Or is it progress towards something different? And I think that and it always suggests that there are these countries that are ahead in the progress, and there are these countries that are behind in that progress. So that's also really problematic. So of course, I think it's important to defend it on the basis of what we were just saying, how if we don't look at the big global issues from this perspective, recognizing the power differences, the equity differences, and so on, we're going to continue to fail in finding any solutions, and also we won't be able to create the spaces for discussing, making it uncomfortable conversations where we realize, maybe I have to step down now, and somebody else has to speak, somebody else is coming from the global south, and so on. So I will continue to defend it, but certainly I'm absolutely aware that it's uncomfortable, that I know that the future will be uncomfortable also.
When we kind of talk about development, there are some communities that feel that we can actually now talk about a space of the future. And then I'm willing to start about redefining what we mean by development. And for me, a capabilities approach within ecological limits is a possibility to redefine that space. But I also recognize that for some communities, there's more baggage than win and gain. So while I would, when I have the chance to explain what I mean, and in a context where we can talk about human flourishing rather than an econocentric vision, where we have the space to explain that this has to happen within ecological limits, and where we actually need to think about well-being as being well-being within nature, and the terminology of progress hasn't helped us in that respect at all. So I would jettison the sort of development as economic growth, and I would jettison development as progress as being part of the epistemic problem that brought us to where we are, and not part of the solution where we need to go. If I then have a chance to then talk about what I mean by development, then I would hang on to it just because it still harbors a sense of a hopeful trajectory of us actually talking about where we want to be. And the beauty of development, and this is that, we're talking about development studies, we're talking about development geography, but, development in other subjects like psychology, for instance, also talks about our personal development, and it actually allows us to talk in a deeply humanistic way about what people will have to be to live in a future that is more sustainable and more harmonious, and where we are not at war with nature. I think there's some really interesting discussions to be had with the humanities in that respect, and philosophers and so forth. And so I think in some ways development can also be an interesting boundary term, where we question not just problematic ways of thinking about development like progress, economic growth, and the sort of problematic dreams of planners of sort of linear processes. But we actually think a lot more so about the nature of humans. So there might be some discursive possibilities there, which I find quite interesting.
Thank you so much. Do you have further questions?
Thanks a lot first for thought-provoking statements and explanations. I have a simple and complicated question. I mean, we can be as reflexive and post-colonial and decolonial in our thinking, and go even into more and more details and fine-grained analysis with all 15 different intersectional lines of differentiation you can draw nowadays or so. But I think maybe the bigger question is how do we speak to power? And how do we, as geographers, how do we as scholars, how do we interact in an environment which is exactly as you, Dorothea, pointed out? So like this nationalist interests, there's
there's populism. It's people are looking down more towards themselves, and you all alluded also. There's big geopolitical interests that are there, which are, as a matter of fact, a lot more powerful than all of our scientific work. Maybe you can provide an example or say how you deal with this dilemma in this field in your own work. Sort of we're all very active, thought-provoking researchers, but I'm sure sometimes you all face a lot of frustration, and when you face the reality of big politics, and how do you take your responsibilities that you have in your privileged position as scholars, and a position how you can gather new knowledge and use that knowledge and then speak to power.
Maybe a brief example that I think about is the question that keeps coming up for me is whether, as a person who works on climate change, whether I can also be an activist, whether it's possible to be a scholar activist, and the tension that creates. For me, it's obvious. There's no question about it. But we know increasingly that climate activists are being really, really limited everywhere. Here in Germany, police raiding activists' homes and so on. So, there's a lot of discourses around this, whether, even from scientists saying, oh, no, you're undermining our credibility by then also standing out in the street protesting, or even starting to talk about, the importance of, who should take action and being political about it. And I think that, this is where the power dimension comes in, because ultimately, to some extent, you can make your own decisions, but you might get arrested, and you might also lose your job. There was a quite a famous case of two scientists in the U.S. who went to a big academic conference and unfurled the banner to say stop fossil fuels, and one of them very famously lost her job as a result in her institution. So, I think this is where it feels like that power, and just recognizing, with the knowledge that she brings, she's continued to work, but I think the point is, that she's lost an opportunity, she has lost some part of her voice because of that. So there are these external power forces that are controlling. I know it's not quite what you were asking about, but I do think that is one example I can think of that very kind of concretely, where that, there is that big scary power out there. I think it limits in some ways what I say on a daily basis, just worrying about what's going to happen.
I think the university is still a space where we need to defend academic freedom, which is under threat in many countries already. And we also know that, in a sense, academic freedom also needs to be reclaimed every day. That includes speaking to power. And arguably, geographers, because historically, we're not the first people, let's face it. Policymakers don't, if they have one call to make, one phone call, are they going to dial the number of the geographer? Or in our field, it's going to be the development economist, probably. So if we're going to be on the panel, I frequently am on the panel with a lot of people also talking in a growth paradigm of development. I'm already the exotic person talking about heterodox notions of development. I might as well say something that really, it becomes a tweet because it's so outrageous. So actually, speaking one's truth, and this is really something I also had to learn, and it's something that is, if you're a participatory researcher, is really challenging, because when I'm working locally, then I'm very conscious that I'm there as a listener first and a speaker much later. And I want to listen to people locally. And I want to listen to narratives and stories that I don't fully understand. And I fully own my ignorance at that point. But there's a time to sometimes just speak with confidence and claim the space that this unjust order of knowledge production has given you. And if you're on the panel, and if you are representing, your discipline or your university and so on, at that particular point, it's your job to basically stand up and talk with conviction. So I think it's also something that's ours to seed. You know, it's like basically we should be, right now, we should be claiming and speaking our truth. And I think, you know, in a future, I would like to see those platforms to be more diverse. I'd like to see more voices that I hear in those participatory workshops, actually making it to the panel directly. But in the meantime, I will take their quotes and bring them and attribute them, but I will try to basically also amplify other voices, and I will try to speak with confidence what, as a geographer, I see as a more holistic engagement with the world. And that sometimes is in contradiction to the dominant narrative of the recent released reports, the policy framework, the log frame, and the sort of economic model.
I think this question is really extremely important, Benjamin. You were asking there, so how do we speak to power? I would reformulate the question, how do we make our research relevant? What are we working? So are we working to write papers for the shelves? Are we actually getting engaged in a world that is unfair, unjust, and unsustainable? My answer to that will be, personally, I'm not the person throwing stones or somehow tying myself to a bridge somewhere, but rather I think we all, people working in science and having the privilege of being at a university, what we can change is the way how we cooperate with other colleagues somewhere else in the world. And that is especially with our partners, in my case, for example, in Africa, where we're trying to make things different through new forms of collaboration. That is my personal approach. And this does not only mean scientific collaboration, it goes far beyond that. Something that I've been doing now for quite a while is that we're trying to change, for example, the visa policy of the German embassies when we invite our colleagues, and we realize that very often people are treated badly or are not given a visa to come here. So to make this separation between the north and the south more open so that we can actually travel. This is one thing where this is probably not directly speaking to power, but it makes a difference whether we somehow develop collaboration in a way that's really fair and global.
Thank you so much. Any further questions?
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. I have one question on the maladaptation on climate change. You, Professor Schipper, you were talking about the agencies, how they implementing climate change adaptation projects and how it's failing, but how can we actually avoid it? Because we tend to think, okay, these people who are implementing these projects are experts in the fields, right? And yeah, maybe you can share your thoughts on it, how we can try to avoid that it really leads to adaptation, not to maladaptation.
I like your point about that these people who are implementing projects are experts, and I think that's exactly the point, that they're actually not experts. They may be good at project management, maybe they know how to balance the budget and how to, you know, start the documentation that's necessary, but they don't know that often, and in the cases where we're talking about maladaptation, they mostly are not experts on the locations where they're doing the projects, and so this is the big problem, and I think partly why worry about, we don't want to categorize any kind of activities necessarily as these are always going to be maladaptive, because it's really about that process of how adaptation projects are implemented. And it's precisely that, if they're only considered to be about climate change, but they're not at all considering all the other issues that are happening, then they're probably going to fail in some way, and they may also make all these other problems worse. And I think it's important to keep in mind that we do have lots and lots of experience of this in just development projects. So regardless of if they're adaptation or climate change related, we have lots and lots of maldevelopment projects, and that's partly, kind of what we look at, and that's a history of kind of the scholarship that we're looking at, is these processes of power imbalances and colonialism. So it's maybe not at all strange that we have lots of maladaptation, since we have lots of maldevelopment as well. Somehow it's getting this special treatment as this new kind of wow, we found this new concept, but really it isn't new. So we should have been able to solve this a long time ago.
Thank you so much. Are there any other further questions?
Thank you also from me for that inspiring talk. And I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned in passing, Dorothea. You said at one point challenges that we're shying away from. Some of you have already mentioned some of the big challenges ahead in terms of development and cooperation. But what might be other challenges ahead that perhaps at the moment scholarly work is ignoring in development geography? What might be other challenges that we are perhaps at risk of overlooking?
Starting with sort of my field in the sort of technology space, for instance, there is, in a sense, there's a huge amount of emphasis on sort of the cutting edge of technologies, the sort of futures. You know, now we've got a lot of discussions about AI for development and so forth. While at the same time, we haven't actually solved sort of basic digital divide issues and questions that have to do with also social norms for technology use. So I think just like sort of a lot of development discourse has a newness bias and a fashion for newness, so do we have in the discussion about technology and development a risk that we always rush to the sort of next fastest, latest innovation, while big equity issues are still with us, and frequently questions of inequalities just get replicated in the next layer of technological innovation. So that's one thing. Also staying with the big structural inequalities that keep being replicated. I think there are some topics that some colleagues shy away from because they're politically so incredibly sort of tense to kind of engage with. And we talked about the question of academic freedom. You know, some people kind of pay quite a high price if they are engaging with some of these topics. Clearly, the climate change activism space is one of those things where it's a sort of challenging area for scholars to position themselves. In my area, in also questions about gender and gender justice, development colleagues have been sort of quite happy to engage with questions of equality for women, but we haven't necessarily talked about gender minorities. We still have LGBTQIS+ people who are largely invisibilized in development studies, and we know that we need to have profound engagements there, including cultural, cross-cultural discussions, which are going to be uncomfortable and which intersect also uncomfortably with histories of colonial imposition. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can just have particular groups that we just structurally ignore, whether that's in the statistics or in the narratives. So that would be examples that come to mind immediately.
If I may add something just to comment, I think it's not only about ignorance or shying away from particular topics, but there's also the inverse. So there's fashions related, for example, to research funding. So topics, if you just look at research funding in the Federal Republic of Germany over the past couple of decades, whenever we had a shift in the government, something like half a year later, some new topics pop up which somehow have something to do with the programs of the parties in power. And that does not mean that people are forgetting about the other issues, but these other issues are somehow more pushed into the shadow because these new topics are financed. And what we do also observe is that some issues obviously have been forgotten. We did already have research on questions of inequality, dependency, etc., which today are not very fashionable. And who knows whether this is going to come again. I mean, I'm looking at Benjamin Etzert. So your research on migration is something which is gets financed from a very particular angle, and I think we have to get farther beyond that to really understand what is going on here in the world.
So I might add one thing that it's not necessarily about studying per se, but I think that there is a very jarring disconnect between development practice and development research, and I would say the Sustainable Development Goals, or the Millennium Development Goals, are probably even worse, which are sort of creating this very reductionist concept of development. As you know, we have all these goals, and then we have these targets, and that's going to be, these are our Sustainable Development Goals. But the problem is, when that happens, all the governments will put their money into those things and forget all the other things that are outside, because not everything is included there. And certainly, I would argue one of the bigger problems is that they're not maybe always set up in the right way, so that they're not actually focusing on the right part of the question, but politically it would be too difficult to talk about something else. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is something that, of course, scholars engage with the questions of that disconnect between practice and policy and research. But yeah, what do we, we say, oh, it's the best available approach, the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, is it really though? And maybe we could be more critical about it. But of course, it's all the governments in the world have agreed on these things. So let's just stick with them. And the problem is that frames research, and that frames what we see as kind of the objectives for development currently. There are these problems as well.
Thank you so much. Let's have one last question from the audience before we wind up.
Thank you very much for the nice discussion going on. Detlef touched on a very crucial aspect in this development research. That's about funding. I was thinking about it and what can we do? Because in the future also, we should really strengthen cooperation with, for example, African researchers, African institutions. And in this process, we should define problems together with them. We should try to be participatory in the problem definition itself, proposal writing itself. Of course, there are a lot of challenges in that process, but we should take time and so on. But funding, funders have their own programs, their own designs and aspects that should be defined as a research problem, and then they have also timelines. In the future, if we want to strengthen this development research, the question is, what can we do? There are important issues that we know, but they may not be in the funding program. So we are we going to shift ourselves always following these funders' policies and guidelines, or we develop a mechanism whereby we inform also funders that there are a lot of issues that are still relevant, and maybe there are some which are forgotten that should be taken up and then funded, so that we can really continue developing this research profile and contribute to policies also, not only in a specific aspect, but in broader aspects of development issues to contribute from science.
Shall I begin? Gilma, thank you very much, and thank you that you're here today. I think that's a very important point. So just some fragments of an answer. One thing, when we observe this volatility of research funding and the way how different topics pop up and then vanish again, in order to stabilize this field a bit more, what's needed is institutions behind research funding, and the Center for Development Research here in Bonn and IDOS and United Nations University are important institutions that somehow create stability beyond these fashionable topics. And I think we can be very proud that we do have these institutions here in Bonn. That's one thing. The second fragment of an answer is that where this is some of the rules of the game in science. So if you always, if scientists just sit down and complain about the unfairness of research funding, yeah, that's our business. I mean, most of the project proposals we write get declined and are not successful. It's very unfortunate, but that's where we invest our time. What we need, and that brings us again to this topic of development geography or development at large. Development is not a very sexy topic. So I would never write a proposal which somehow says something about small-scale development, blah, 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 somewhere. Nobody cares for these things. You will not get money for that. So you have to sell the research interest differently. And I think our Collaborative Research Center is a good example for that. So from the very beginning, we avoided the term development. It's nowhere in the proposal. We don't talk about development. We just talk about future making. Basically, what you do if you want to be successful in generating research money is that you come up with new ideas, approaching sometimes old topics and problems from a new angle, or linking topics to new theoretical debates. That may also be something like this whole field of future study is relatively new compared to the old field of development studies. And that helps us to generate research funding also in the field of development studies, and especially at a place like here in Bonn.
Thank you so much.
Just coming back to that, like I have a pragmatic answer and I have a sort of utopian answer, but it's not entirely utopian. So I think my pragmatic answer is, yeah, do the map of the buzzwords, check out what the latest thing is for the funder, check out also what the current domestic topics are, which will then be reflected in also the sort of foreign policy and also the, if you want, development frameworks that they are after. Okay, fine. This is a sort of a strategic mapping, and we can support each other in basically being strategic by, for example, also advising each other on strategy. I think my utopian answer is, and that comes from, I guess, the normative position of thinking about a plurality and a diversity of development visions. It's like, I find it very strange that if you have a kind of competition for funding, that a lot of proposals, whichever country they're coming from, sound so similar, when surely people have culturally different visions of what futures they would want. So then we need to think about how do we turn some of the kind of the funding streams around to allow for that plurality, because otherwise we're not going to get the epistemic diversity which we need, and the multiple flows of knowledge and so forth, because frankly, in order to produce knowledge, you need some funding. So in order to do so, we probably need to challenge funders, but also scholars, whether it's in the Global South or in the Global North, to actually have some more open-ended funding opportunities that also allow for some more blue skies, imaginative work, and dare I say it, if you do participatory work, also more open-ended project outcomes, where you basically say, this is the process of workshops that I'm going to have, for example, on what futures people desire, but I can't tell you what they're going to come up with, and I can't tell you what in 4 years' time will be our impacts, because we're still going to co-design and co-define this. And just in case this is sounds like completely pie in the sky, there are some funders. I would positively mention IDRC here, the International Development Research Center in Canada, that have been experimenting with these models of more participatory co-design ways of using that funding. And I think we should strengthen their back by offering them some great project outcomes as well.
I think I was actually going to mention IDRC, big cause that they've had recently called the CLARE projects. And they're about adaptation and resilience. And the IDRC has some really sort of critical criteria for how you can even get the money. And you have to have partnership from the Global South. And I think in the UK there have been other kinds of approaches where have been sort of demand-driven research in the Global South, which is still led by an institution in the UK, so it's not really going all the way and thinking about that. Maybe perhaps I should mention, because I've been looking at this for a long time, is sort of there are inherent biases also that are beyond the topics that we're looking, the way that we write proposals. There are gender biases, there are racial biases, there are other kinds of equity biases that come in the decision-making process. So it's not, everybody who goes into writing proposals is not equal from the perspective of the reviewer. And that comes to things like where there's some of these projects where you have to go out for interviews and there will be unconscious biases against you if you're a woman or if you're coming from a name that can't be pronounced easily for the people who are sitting in the room or something like that. But also that sort of, there are certain kinds of perspectives never get included. So a lot of these funding calls don't consider people who, for example, might need more time to write, so who have dyslexia or other kinds of situations or have huge caring duties and just don't have the time to write. The deadlines when the proposals are for, you put them in right after Christmas. If you have a family, you're not going to be able to probably get that proposal in because you're probably going to be taking care of your family over Christmas. So, I mean, I just want to add that because I think it's an important part when we consider that it's not always the best research that gets funded. There are inherent biases as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the interesting questions. And I would like to warmly thank all the experts here that were able to come and discuss with us all the interesting topics. Thank you for giving us all the knowledge that we were so excited to know. And thank you for attending as well. Thank you everyone for showing up and have a good evening.